Election update, the South Carolina primary. Now reporting, Whit Johnson.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for our continuing coverage of the South Carolina Republican primary. Right now, ABC News can project, based on exit poll data, that Donald Trump, the former president, has won the state of South Carolina, beating Nikki Haley in her home state. Let's get right to our Rachel Scott, who's on the campaign trail in South Carolina at Trump headquarters. Rachel.
Yeah, well, former President Donald Trump has already taken the stage here. He has taken quite the victory lap. Behind us on stage right now is the former president with his close aides, advisors, as well as his family. And also notable here, you have South Carolina's 2 Republican senators on stage, including Senator Tim Scott, who Nikki Haley actually appointed to the Senate. Let's take a listen to what the former president is saying.
And much more importantly, his wife, Peggy, she's with him all the way, I'll tell you. Never saw anything. What a couple. But I'd like to ask him to say a few words. He's a very special man, an incredible governor, very popular in the state. And really, I mean, he gave us some very good advice. And he has right from the beginning. You know, from the day I announced, I had the lieutenant governor. He was the lieutenant governor. And from right at the beginning, when I announced, and I said, I don't know the gentleman. Is he good? They said, he's really great. I said, well, I hope so. And you know what? Within about 2 weeks, I said, that guy is unbelievable. You know, I never got the support of the governor. She supported somebody else, but I had the support of somebody much, much better, Henry McMaster, and we won in a landslide. And I'd like to ask the governor to say a few words. Please, Henry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll be very brief. Well, I would like you all to remember.
All right, so there you have it. You see the former president on stage. He's thanking Republicans for really coalescing behind him here in South Carolina, one by one. Even his former rivals like Senator Tim Scott. You see him behind him. Obviously, he is one that is sort of gunning for that vice presidential pick slot if Donald Trump is able to clinch the Republican nomination. But Trump really making this a general election pitch here tonight, and he did address one of the top issues that we are seeing on those early exit polls that are coming out, immigration. He says that he does want to fix the border. Of course, you know that border deal fell apart there on Capitol Hill, and a lot of that had to do with Donald Trump pressing Republicans not to support it so that he can handle it if he is elected to the White House. Whit.
All right, Rachel, stand by. Let's go to Alex Brochet, who's at Nikki Haley headquarters in Charleston, South Carolina. Alex, the Nikki Haley campaign, they knew they had an uphill battle going into tonight. What are you hearing from the campaign?
Well, Whit, listen, by this time, they know the results of tonight. They know that this primary has been declared for Donald Trump. But you see what's going on behind me, this cheering. It is a more subdued crowd, but certainly spirited. And one of the things, we got a chance to talk with a campaign spokesperson. Tonight's results weren't a surprise. Certainly, they had seen the polling data coming into tonight. Even on Friday, a call with reporters, they had acknowledged that it was going to be an uphill battle. But again, Nikki Haley has continued to affirm that she is charging past South Carolina. They've got big ad buys in Michigan on up through Super Tuesday. And one of the things they're going to be continuing to focus on is the character issues that they say the former president has, hoping that that's something that allows them to attract more moderates toward their campaign in the coming weeks.
Alex, thanks so much. We now have some of the vote coming in. Let's go ahead and take a look and see some of this data that's coming out. Again, the projection is already in based on the exit polls. But right now that we can see 66% so far for Trump, 33% for Nikki Haley. This is just 1% of the vote that's in. So again, early data, but it is so far reflecting what we saw in the polls going into this, because Donald Trump was leading by about 30 points in those polls. So let's go ahead and go to ABC's political director, Rick Klein, for a look at the map and the electorate here. So far, Rick, things seem to be playing out like many people had expected, but what does the path now look like for Nikki Haley going forward?
Yeah, so far we're seeing the numbers kind of line up the way that we'd expect. I'm looking tonight to see what we see out of some of the bigger population centers. There were 2 counties, actually, that Marco Rubio won 8 years ago. That's key if Nikki Haley is going to be competitive tonight. But you're exactly right that this bodes very poorly for the rest of the campaign. The battleground map from here, because Super Tuesday is so many states, is just unbelievably narrow. And I've been talking to the campaign about this, and they're going to be campaigning across the country. They insist she's not going anywhere. She's not leaving the race. But they're also kind of hedging and saying that Super Tuesday is kind of the last planning they're doing. Super Tuesday itself is pretty narrow. We're going to be looking tonight to see if she gets shut out entirely in South Carolina. If she wins any of the congressional districts, she might actually get a couple of delegates out of the state. But then she's going to have to kind of hopscotch through a bunch of different states. Texas is a big one. North Carolina and Virginia have a whole bunch of delegates. Maybe she wins some congressional districts, but the scope of the campaign will be different from this moment forward. Donald Trump is in such a commanding position in terms of the delegates and in terms of the very brutal math from here.
And Rick, I know we're looking ahead to Super Tuesday, but if we could come back to South Carolina just for a moment, give us a sense of who the voters were, what we know about them, and the people who turned out today.
Yeah, look, I mean, today we know that this is a much different electorate than we've seen in the past, but only at so far at the margins. We know that there's a couple more Democrats, very small numbers, a little bit fewer independents, and a lot of people that say they're actually not part of any of those movements. They say they're none of these at all. It'd be interesting to see how they end up breaking. This is what the history has been in South Carolina. Usually there's a Republican primary. About 3/4 of the voters are actually Republicans. In South Carolina, as long as you didn't vote in the other party's primary, you get to vote in this one. Nikki Haley tried really hard to get this number up. Right now, we're tracking it, though, around 21%. It doesn't look like she was able to change the electorate. And where does that matter from here? That's the same kind of thing she needs to happen in those states going forward. She is looking at the states that allow independents, that allow Democrats to vote, because she's making this general election argument. She's saying, pick me because I can beat Joe Biden in the fall. So far, though, we just haven't seen her be able to transform an electorate anywhere, including in her home state tonight.
All right, Rick, thank you so much. Let's bring in our Deputy Political Director, Avery Harper, and our White House correspondent, Mary Alice Parks, are at the desk with me. And Avery, I know you've been looking at the exit poll data and speaking to the point that Rick was making, that Haley was suggesting that she would be the better candidate to go up against Joe Biden in November. But it seems here, at least in South Carolina, strong support for Donald Trump, clearly, but also they have confidence that he's the guy to win.
Right. They definitely have confidence that he is the guy who is going to win in November. And I find it really interesting in terms of this preliminary exit poll data, just when folks made their decision about who they were going to vote for. When you take a look at the exit polls and the data that we're getting in, we find that the vast majority, 77% of voters made their decision up last year. This is before January. So there was very little that anyone could have done to change the trajectory of this race. And I think it really did reflect in terms of how we saw these candidates campaign in the state of South Carolina. And then also in terms of the most important issues that voters thought about as they were casting their ballots. 39% said immigration, 33% said economy, foreign policy came in at 11%, and abortion at 10%. I find this interesting, too. South Carolina is not a border state. South Carolina is not a state that has been targeted by some of the migrant transports that we've seen from the southern border to points north. But the anxieties about what's going on at the southern border is really driving folks to come out to the ballot box.
And Mary Alice, to you now, another thing that was really interesting in all this is just how long voters had their minds already made up. If they wanted to vote for Trump, they had this decision made essentially a year ago.
Yeah, and that doesn't favor Nikki Haley, who had always made this argument that if enough time passed, if she could winnow the field, if she could get it down to a two-person race, then she got to, as she said, go to her sweet home of South Carolina. And look, there was an argument there. Normally, a governor of an early state has a huge advantage. I mean, tonight I'm going to be watching for, obviously, all of us are, how close the margin ends up if she wins by even her own metric. I mean, remember, out of New Hampshire, she said she needed to improve upon her New Hampshire results in South Carolina. I mean, there she only lost by 11 points. If we see her get closer than 11 points, you have some argument to stand on going into South Carolina. What's going to be so hard is if these sorts of numbers hold. I mean, that's the issue for her. Does she even show improvement next to Trump in her home state?
And Mary Alice, just to follow up on that, what about this idea? I mean, there's a lot of talk. Obviously, the Haley campaign doesn't acknowledge it out loud, but this idea of like an insurance policy campaign, if Trump were to implode somehow, then she'd be there collecting delegates and ready to go. How long is something like that sustainable?
Until the money dries up. I mean,
but remarkably,
that's
there's still been money in the race.
100%, which is why I mentioned it. I mean, she has proven time and time again that she can fundraise. In January, her campaign outraised Trump's campaign. Now, of course, he brings in money through other means, through PACs, a super PAC. But the reality is she has proven herself to be a prolific fundraiser. Donors have stuck by her. Big donors buy that argument of needing an insurance policy in the Republican primary. And normally, that's when campaigns have to close up shop, as if they run out of money. And right now, she's not running out of money. Most interesting to me was those comments that she made. Rick mentioned them, that she's really hasn't thought past Super Tuesday. You have to think past a week from now, 10 days from now, to have a plan for staffing for visits. But I do think that argument about having an insurance policy resonates in Washington, where especially Republicans who are worried about their own races, statewide races back home, they look at some of those Trump spending numbers. We haven't talked about it yet, but the money that we know his campaign has spent on legal fees. There's a lot of Republicans anxious about that, what that could mean for his support, his willingness to support other candidates in their states, and they're not sure. They think it might not be so bad to have someone else still in this race.
All right, well, stand by. We'll talk more throughout the evening. Let's bring in Ramesh Ponnuru, a National Review editor and ABC News contributor and conservative commentator. Ramesh, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I just want to get your take on that. If some of these numbers hold, right, if this lead remains this significant, Trump over Haley, where does she generate the energy and the excitement to then go in and campaign in Super Tuesday states?
Well, I think that this result, if it ends up being a kind of blowout for Trump over Haley, really ends Haley as a candidate for the Republican nomination, and she becomes just a kind of receptacle for a protest vote. And the question is whether that is a path that she wants to take. That is the sort of path that might make it possible for her, if Trump loses in November, to run a kind of I told you so campaign in 2028. But the odds of her actually getting the nomination this year, that doesn't look like it's happening.
But Ramesh, obviously, she's a young politician, has a long future ahead of her. Doesn't she need to be calculating her political future here, right? If she stays in too long, then she can alienate some conservatives who might support her down the road.
I'm sure that that is a judgment that she is going to be making on a day-to-day basis. And one thing we know about these campaigns is they'll always say, we're in it for the long haul, right until the moment they decide to pull out.
Ramesh, thank you so much. Let's bring in former Senator and North Dakota, from North Dakota, that is Heidi Heitkamp, who is a Democratic strategist and our ABC News contributor. Heidi, thank you so much for joining us. I just want to get your take on what we're seeing playing out in South Carolina and this promise from the Haley campaign that she's going to stay in it through Super Tuesday.
She's going to stay in as long as she has money. But let's be honest, after Super Tuesday, I don't think she's going to be a candidate anymore for president of the United States. And how Democrats are going to look at this is that, what does this say about the fall election ballot? I think way too often we talk about this blowout. We should treat Donald Trump as if he were the incumbent Republican president, and he's losing a third of his party in states like South Carolina. And so I think it speaks to some weakness that Trump has. When you look at the preliminary exit polls, however, I think it's interesting that when you ask those voters about electability, they thought Donald Trump was more electable than Nikki Haley. And I think that hurt her in South Carolina, and it doesn't bode well for that argument going across Super Tuesday.
Well, Heidi, we've heard from the Biden campaign that they want to take on Trump directly. They're essentially calling him the nominee. But we've also heard some, and Governor Gavin Newsom made these comments recently, that some Democrats actually like the idea of Nikki Haley staying in the race because she can continue to make the case against Donald Trump. How do Democrats perceive that going forward?
Well, I mean, you always want a two-front war, and that's what this is. As long as she's in there saying that he is irresponsible, that, I think the comments that he made about African Americans she called ridiculous. She's been a real asset. And I think to this point, to your point earlier, does that mean if she continues this, does she so alienate the Republican base that she poisons the well for future runs? And I think that's why after Super Tuesday, she's out.
There'll be a lot of decisions for the Haley campaign to make in the coming days. Thank you so much. Let's go back to Avery Harper here. You're getting more information in the exit poll data. What's standing out to you?
Right, more preliminary exit poll data, and I find it really fascinating, the numbers that we're getting in terms of folks who were voting for either Trump or for Haley, if they think that that candidate was going to be able to defeat Biden in November. For Trump voters, what we saw is a lot of confidence on the part of Trump voters, 83% saying that Trump was very likely to beat Biden in November, only 16% saying that he was going to lose to Biden in November. On the other hand, for Haley voters, we're not seeing the same levels of confidence. What we're seeing is 57% say that Haley is likely to beat Biden in November. 42% say she is not likely to beat Biden in November. I think that gets at what voters really would like to see. Voters want to be confident that the folks that they vote for can win. And Nikki Haley has not won a single nominating contest yet. And so that makes it really difficult to convince voters down the road when we're looking at a contest like Super Tuesday, when we're going to see 15 states and a territory cast ballots, that she is the candidate that they should put their ballots in for.
And she has made that case consistently, pointing to national head-to-head polls, Haley up against Joe Biden, that she would be that better candidate. But when we look at this, it tells a bit of a different story. Obviously, this is one state. This is the people who turned out. But it is difficult for her to then go from here and continue to make that case. Let's go back to Rick Klein, because as we're looking ahead to Super Tuesday and looking at that math, you spelled out the challenges that Nikki Haley is facing, but is there still an opportunity for her to pick up a few delegates along the way?
Yeah, well, look, the delegate rules are different in every state, and they're really complicated. And one of the things that happened since last time, is the Trump campaign rewrote a lot of the delegate rules to make it more favorable for them, which makes it harder to catch up. But in a state like South Carolina, you get most of the delegates if you win the state, 29 out of the 50. The other 21, though, get divvied up among the 7 congressional districts. So that means that Nikki Haley still tonight has an opportunity to not get totally shut out of her home state. Just starting right now in her hometown or home county of Charleston, very little vote in, but you're seeing a Haley edge right there. And similarly in Columbia, of course, a college town where the state capital is, about a quarter of the vote in, and a decent size edge. I expect that we'd see Haley run very well in Columbia. The question is going to be, how does this match up with the district maps? So there are, like I said, 7 congressional districts. There's one right here on the coast that includes a lot of the home territory of Nikki Haley. That would be very key for her. And up here in this middle part of the state, that is the majority black congressional district. It's occupied by James Clyburn, the top Democrat who was so critical in engineering Joe Biden's victory in this state. There's another congressional district a little bit north of there that takes in parts of Columbia. So there's a chance still for Nikki Haley. And if she wins any of those congressional districts, she can say, A, I didn't get shut out, and B, the kinds of voters that are there, independent voters, maybe even some Democrats who decided to cross over and vote in the Republican primary, that's the kind of voters that a winning Republican candidate is going to need.
Yeah, potentially helping her to pick up some delegates, but not getting her any closer to the nomination, really. Let's go back to Ramesh for your perspective on this part of it, because how much pressure is she going to face to get out of the race after South Carolina? Can she still maintain enough support and enough funding from donors to do what she says she's going to do and keep going through Super Tuesday?
Well, I think she's going to face enormous pressure because with the door to the nomination effectively being closed, a lot of Republicans are going to say, look, we have to unite. We have to unite. Trump is going to be the nominee, so let's finish this off, endorse him, and move on to the Trump-Biden contest. She's going to have money. The question, I think, is really going to be, do Republican voters force her out simply by saying, this is over and we've had enough?
And Ramesh, I do want to follow up on something. Heidi noted this, and it was one of the headlines of this evening on World News. The racially charged comments that Donald Trump made at an event overnight. He was speaking directly to a crowd of conservative voters. Nikki Haley responded, calling his comments disgusting. Let's go ahead and take a look at the comments that the former president made.
The mugshot, we've all seen the mugshot. And You know who embraced it more than anybody else? The black population. It's incredible. You see black people walking around with my mugshot. You know, they do shirts and they sell them for $19 a piece. It's pretty amazing.
So as I noted, Haley called those comments disgusting. The Joe Biden campaign called it insulting and just plain racist. Haley has made this case that this is why she needs to stay in the race in case Trump implodes in one way or another. How much of a challenge is this for the Republican Party going forward, or is it at all?
Well, look, the Trump personality, the kinds of things that he says that he has always said, those things obviously don't hurt him with Republican primary voters. They do hurt him with the general electorate. It's one of the reasons why, even when he was president and had a good economy, he was consistently unpopular. The problem with the backup strategy that Nikki Haley is now talking about a little bit, and that other people certainly are talking about for her, if something were to happen, if an indictment or a conviction or an accident or an asteroid were to hit him, the party will not turn to somebody who has been calling Donald Trump unhinged and whom Trump has been attacking so viciously, because it is a pro-Trump party. It is a party that really likes Donald Trump.
Let's go back to Ramesh. Thank you. Let's go back to Rachel Scott, who's been on the campaign trail in South Carolina. Rachel, you spoke with Nikki Haley about this specifically. What struck you about what she said in response to the former president?
Yeah, well, you know, I asked Nikki Haley about this right after she voted here in the South Carolina primary, and I kind of just went down the list of the comments that the former president said while speaking at that Black conservative gala just last night. And as I was going down that list, she was shaking her head. So take a listen to what she told me and how she reacted.
This is a huge warning sign. We have to stop with the chaos. We have to stop with the drama. We have to stop with the bad sound bites that keep happening over and over again and listen to the American people.
Yeah, so there you heard Nikki Haley, and this is the argument that she has been making, that Donald Trump is a distraction. She says that every single day that he goes off script on the teleprompter, says something that's racially offensive or offends some type of group of Americans in this country is one day that the Republican Party is not focused on beating President Biden in November, that they're not focused on the key issues, that he only breeds chaos and that chaos only follows the former president. Now, Trump here is trying to see a little bit of an opening when it comes to black voters nationally. We know that he got about 6% of the black vote back in 2016, 8% in 2020. Black voters, we know, overwhelmingly vote Democratic. And of course, President Biden's approval ratings have been dropping nationally, but also among black voters. So Trump here is really trying to make this appeal, but Democrats point out that this is very rich for the former president to be making these sort of comparisons. You remember right after George Floyd was murdered, he used the term thugs to describe people that were protesting in the streets, calling for racial equality and justice. Compare that to some of the things that the former president has said when you had rioters that stormed the Capitol. He called them patriots. And so you have Democrats today, especially the Biden campaign, making those direct comparisons between what Donald Trump is saying to try to appeal to black voters and what he has said in the past with.
Rachel, thank you. Let's bring in Alex Prochet, who is at Nikki Haley headquarters in Charleston, South Carolina. Alex, I know you've been out there, you've been talking to campaign officials and voters. What are they telling you, not only about this issue we've been discussing, but about Nikki Haley's path forward?
Well, they understand that it is an uphill battle, and that path, as been mentioned earlier today, is increasingly narrow. But even tonight, as we've declared this now for former President Trump, she's facing pressure in her own state to drop out. The South Carolina Republican Party out with a statement saying that South Carolina is Trump country once again, and that now is a time to unite our party and put Donald Trump back in the White House. And one of the things that we've heard from the Haley campaign is that they are resisting, that Nikki Haley is not going to bow down and kiss the ring, as she's put it, over the recent week, and they're going to continue this out. And again, they have ad buys going up into Super Tuesday, but as we've mentioned, that path is getting increasingly narrow, and the campaign won't commit to a plan post Super Tuesday.
Alex, thank you. Let's come back to Avery and Mary Alice here on this same issue. Former President Trump has said many things throughout the course of his political career here, but his voters, his supporters have remained loyal through it all. Is this just another bump in the road?
Right. I don't think that this is necessarily something that's going to make a difference in terms of this primary. When we look at the breakdown of this electorate in South Carolina, what we find is that it was overwhelmingly white. 92% of the folks that came out to vote, according to our preliminary exit poll data, were white. Only 3% were black. Only 3% were Hispanic or Latino. I think also the response from the Biden campaign, that this was something that was moronic for Biden to say. They are trying to persuade black voters to participate. They need black voters on the Democratic side of this campaign. And so they're going to have to come up with more than just the outrageous things that Trump says about black voters, about black people, in order to motivate those voters to come out. Still very important that we point out the things that he says, but this is not something that was surprising, I think, if you were a black voter and woke up this morning and saw those comments from former President Trump.
I'm wondering if Republicans need to be a little bit careful about what they wish for. They're talking about the benefits of uniting around a nominee. Makes sense. Stop fighting, stop spending money fighting in a primary. But the other side of that is more scrutiny and more airtime of every single one of these things that former President Trump says. And we know is that those comments do isolate general election voters. We've all talked to those voters who maybe those independents who are dissatisfied with Biden, those independents who were interested in Nikki Haley, and it is these kinds of comments that we saw last night that turn them off. That they end those conversations with, I'm not voting for that guy. And the Republican Party is going to have to figure out how to address that, how they talk to those voters, or are those really voters that are up for grabs?
And we actually heard from some of those voters throughout our reporting this weekend in South Carolina, and even Republicans, despite the fact that former President Trump still has this majority of support within the party, there is still a percentage that is concerned about the future of the GOP. And there are many who were saying, you know what, I'm torn if it's a Trump-Biden in November, what they're going to do. I mean, even those who voted Republican and voted Trump twice are still concerned. There is still that element out there.
I mean, when you look at, when you look at the data that shows just how vulnerable President Biden is. I mean, how many voters are worried about his age, his approval ratings? There are voters to be won. The question is, are Republicans capitalizing on that? You know, I think back to conversations I've had that just run the gamut. I've talked to former Democrats that say they are frustrated with Joe Biden, but if Trump is the nominee, they will absolutely come out and support Biden, that Trump is just that much of a motivating force. I've talked to Republicans who tell me they don't like Trump, they can't stand him, they want to vote for anyone else, but if he's the nominee, they'll stick by him. I mean, that's the nature of a general election, and I think that after tonight, it looks like we are, closer and closer on that path. And obviously, these two front runners, the president and the former president, are operating like it's already a general election, and so those voters become even more the focus point of our reporting.
Well, let's go back to Ramesh. Ramesh, I understand that you have some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I think that it is absolutely right that most Americans did not enjoy the experience of having Trump constantly in their face and in their Twitter feed during his presidency. And he has benefited from being able to be a looming presence in American politics without being quite so much a constant presence right up in there. And I suspect that they're not going to like it again when they're reminded of what that experience is like. And so I do think that it might be the case that starting the general election early could end up hurting Trump, and he is benefiting a little bit from the fact that it hasn't really started yet.
Avery, let's go back to you, because we also have some exit poll data. Like, what happens if Trump is convicted of some of these crimes, and the voters have some strong opinions on it?
Right. I think when we look at this preliminary exit poll data, what we find is that there is a significant amount of voters for whom it does not matter at all. Take a look at this. It says, is Trump fit to be president if convicted? 63% said yes. Only 34% percent said no. And that really jives with what we've seen this entire election season in terms of how these races or how these indictments, how his legal troubles are impacting the campaign. There are a lot of folks who are sticking by him no matter what.
And let's go back to Heidi Heitkamp if we can. People sticking by President Trump no matter what. But this is something that the Biden campaign continues to point out over and over again.
Yeah, but look at this. 33% of the most loyal, that's who vote in this primary. The absolutely hardcore Republicans, and 33% of them are saying, you know, not sure I really like having him be the nominee again. And so I think you have to look at these not as if you were looking at a poll of all voters, but you are looking at a microcosm of the most loyal Republicans who 33%, if he gets conviction, they're not really excited about that. And so I think it's a matter of analyzing who you're polling here, along with kind of what the path forward is for anyone who challenges him. The rules are such that no one's going to be able to take him out. But if I were on the Trump campaign, I would not be happy with any of these primaries or any of these numbers, because he should be getting 80, 90%.
Heidi, thank you. Let's go back to the Trump campaign and check in with Rachel Scott once again, because, you know, despite all of these things and the multiple criminal cases and the indictments, the Trump campaign, for the most part, believes this is helping him.
They do. This is the cornerstone of Trump's argument. He says it time and time again out on the campaign trail, making all of his legal troubles really his pitch to voters out here that he's fighting for them, that this is all, in his words, a witch hunt. But here is sort of the issue for Donald Trump in the longer term, is that he was just hit with that $355 million fraud fine. Well, he is using campaign funds to pay for his legal fees. He spent $50 million from the campaign on legal fees last year alone. 90% of the money that his super PAC spent in January was spent on legal fees. And so you're going to see this come up time and time again. Meanwhile, you have President Biden, who's raking in the cash. He's able to focus all of that campaign funding on actual campaign resources. You know, one other interesting thing that I want to note here tonight is that the former president did not mention Nikki Haley. I mean, it shows you really where his perspective is at this point after she lost to him in both Iowa and New Hampshire. He didn't even really go after her at all tonight. He is laser focused on this general election. He mentioned President Biden multiple times. He also mentioned a potential next RNC chair, Michael Whatley, and though that may not be someone that most Americans know, Donald Trump did point out one thing that he does like about him, and that was that he was pivotal in sort of these efforts and pushing these efforts to try and overturn the 2020 election. You see the RNC and you see the Trump campaign. They are coming closer together, even though you still have another Republican challenger, Nikki Haley, still in this race with.
Rachel, thank you. Let's bring in Walter Wetzel, is a GOP political consultant in South Carolina. He's mentored and advised Nikki Haley and joins us now from Charleston, South Carolina. Walter, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your perspective here. So I see you're at Nikki Haley headquarters. What is her path heading into Super Tuesday? Where does she find the energy and the support to keep going?
Look, she's got a long history of having more energy than anybody else, right? And from a candidate standpoint, I think she believes exactly what she said last Tuesday, that there's a pathway forward. It may be slim, but as long as a majority of Republicans and a majority of Americans want a choice in this election, I think she's planning on sticking through this. I think to your former guest that pointed out, normally in a situation like this, donations dry up before the candidate's passion to continue dries up, and that's not the case for her right now. And so as long as there's gas in the engine, I think she's prepared to continue driving that car as long as she can.
And Walter, I'd like to ask you more about that. You mentioned that the donations are not drying up right now. Why do you think that is? Why is there still this element, essentially unlike we've ever seen before? I mean, Trump continues to change the political norms as we knew them pre-Donald Trump. So now you have somebody like Nikki Haley, who people keep funding her campaign despite the delegate math before them. What do you think that is? How would you characterize what keeps this campaign going?
Yeah, well, look, I'm not sure it makes for a good campaign talking point, but it is certainly the reality that Nikki Haley continues in every national poll that's out there in head-to-head matchup with President Biden, beating him by 10 or 12 or 14 or 18 points as late as this week, while Donald Trump is within the margin of error of Biden defeating him. So I think to Republicans, while that may not be a great argument to make to glean votes, it is certainly something on the minds of all independent voters, all moderate voters, lots of Republicans in other states that don't have one of these first 2 or 3 shots at this. I think it's a compelling argument. I think people in our party are anxious for a sure win against Joe Biden in November, and to that extent, her argument on this makes a lot of sense, given the polling data.
You think Donald Trump can beat Joe Biden?
We'll see, right? I think he's got a lot of other things between now and November to get over in order for us to have a better picture of that.
But Walter, will people like you rally behind Trump if ultimately he becomes the nominee?
Look, I think it's a hypothetical, and as long as there are options and there are choices, we don't have to go there, and that's a blessing perhaps for some, and a pain for those like that want to go there. I just think as long as there's a choice, and as long as other people are out there giving voters that choice, we got a long way to go, right? 3 states down, lots left. We'll see.
Walter Wetzel, thank you so much for your time tonight. We do appreciate it. Let's bring in South Carolina Republican Congresswoman Nancy Mace at Trump headquarters. Mace has endorsed Donald Trump and has been mentioned as a potential running mate. We'll see what happens going forward. Congresswoman, thank you for your time tonight. What did these early numbers, sort of the preliminary numbers come in that are coming in now? What do they say to you about Trump's strength moving forward?
Well, it's another historic win in another state. In South Carolina, we pick presidents. If you win South Carolina, you will go on to win the nomination historically. And when you do the delegate math, when you do go state by state, there's not a single state that unfortunately Nikki Haley can win. The delegate math does not add up. Donald Trump's going to win it all. He's going to be the man that Republicans want to nominate for president. He is the presumptive nominee tonight.
Does it concern you in any way that Nikki Haley has suggested she's going to stay in this race through Super Tuesday? We don't know what could happen beyond that, but does that hurt Trump's momentum?
Well, it's a mistake for anyone within our party to continue to take shots at Donald Trump when really we should be uniting and focusing on November. We need to raise money for November. We need to get out there and talk about the policies that Donald Trump is strong on, like immigration, like border security, how we're going to cut inflation, how we're going to tackle the economy and spending, all those things that voters care about, right, left, and independent.
So beyond all of that, though, and some of the top issues, what did you think about Donald Trump comparing his own issues and the criminal cases and indictments to the historic discrimination against Black Americans?
I didn't hear those comments, but what I will say is that the vast majority of Republicans, they have shown state by state, he is the man that they want to nominate to be their president in the November 2024 election.
But you know, I mean, even if you didn't hear those comments, you know that going into the general election, it's going to take some moderates, it's going to take some independents to help propel the nominee to the White House. Do comments like that concern you in any way?
You're looking at a president under his tenure who did a lot of bipartisan civil rights work, including in December of 2018, he signed a bipartisan prison reform bill into law. He has pardoned many Black Americans. He cares about every single American, no matter the color of their skin or their gender. We saw that when he was president, and you're going to see that again going forward.
Are you going to stay on the campaign trail with the former president?
I think it's important. I would like to help, especially with suburban women, especially when we're talking about issues that left of center, right of center. We know that abortion is going to be a major issue. We saw the ruling in Alabama this week regarding IVF, but there are a lot of issues that independent-minded voters care about. I would like to continue talking about those issues, campaigning about those issues, because as a suburban mom, I come from a very purple district, and we got to win over independents going into November.
Speaking of IVF, the Biden campaign says that's a direct result of former President Donald Trump's legacy in the courts, overturning Roe v. Wade, leaving this uncertainty across the country. What is your take on IVF and whether it should be legal across the country, and what Republicans are going to do about those protections?
I'm going to do everything in my power to ensure that there are no bans on IVF. Every woman in every state across the country should have access to IVF. And that's something that Donald Trump said yesterday at his rally in Rock Hill. He agrees with that perspective. And already the state legislature in Alabama is fast-tracking legislation at the state level to fix that ruling in Alabama. And so that's where we got to make sure. And I've been talking to South Carolina lawmakers to make sure that our state is going to do everything it can to protect IVF and that there aren't any measures getting in the way either. We got to make sure that every state protects every woman.
Have you had direct conversations with the Trump campaign about being a potential running mate?
I have not. I love South Carolina. I can't remember the last time a House member became a vice presidential candidate. My focus has always been on the Low Country in South Carolina's 1st congressional district. I grew up here. I'm from here, raising my family here. I love South Carolina. I'm going to continue to serve here.
Okay, didn't quite answer the question directly, but Congresswoman Nancy Mace, thank you for your time this morning. We do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Let's go back to our political director, Rick Klein, joining us now from Washington with a look at Nikki Haley's path. Again, we're getting some of these numbers coming in here now showing former President Donald Trump up 58% to 40%. 20% of the vote in. But again, the projection is for the former president based on exit polls. So let's go back to Rick Klein as we're looking at the map here. Rick, once again, we continue to hear from supporters of Nikki Haley that they want her to keep going. They still want to have this alternative to Trump, this option. But the question becomes how realistic it is looking at the map.
Yeah, what Nikki Haley has said and what her supporters have said, close the gap, continue to close the gap. They point out that she was one of, 14, 15 candidates originally. She beat all the others, and now she's the last one standing. And to the point of closing the gap, as we see this right now, the margin looking at around 18 points. For some perspective on this is what the Haley campaign will tell you. They'll say, look, we went to Iowa, and yeah, we got blown out. Remember, DeSantis was still in the race. She lost by 32 points. Then things moved to New Hampshire. A little bit of a disappointment, but she pulled relatively close to 11 points. Then things moved now to her home state of South Carolina. And this is why the margin matters for two reasons. One is this perception of momentum that she's trying to create. The other is in the delegate race. There's a chance for her to still get delegates tonight, even if she loses big. Right now, she's down by about 13 points. That's worse than the margin in New Hampshire. That's not closing the gap. But as you can see, Charleston, that's Nancy Mace's district, by the way, we're seeing a little bit of a lead for Nikki Haley. It turns out that Haley's up there relatively comfortably, although we still don't have a lot of vote in. So that congressional district there in the Low Country potentially is something that she could win. Similarly, where Haley's own hometown of Bamberg is, she's losing that county, but this is part of the 6th congressional district, a majority black district that would seem to be fertile territory for her among independent and Democratic voters. And in Columbia, in the state capital, she is ahead. So that gets to the type of voter we're talking about, more likely to have independent voters, younger voters, women voters, voters of color even crossing over and voting in the Republican primary. That's the argument that Haley's trying to stitch together. And I do think that where those numbers land tonight will be important for that perception. It's hard for her to make a case to continue on if she gets absolutely obliterated, blown out across the state. But if she can pick up some delegates in a few parts of the state and keep that margin relatively close, at least she has an argument to head to Super Tuesday and beyond.
Yeah, in some ways, it's a double-edged sword, though, because Donald Trump and other Republicans have also accused her of trying to go after Democrats and moderates and independents, but she's also used that to help buoy her campaign going forward. So, Rick, thank you on that. Let's go back to Heidi Heitkamp for just final thoughts here. How do you think Democrats are going to be looking at the results in South Carolina and what it means for the Biden campaign?
I think they're going to see a very vulnerable Donald Trump. If she gets 40% in among this very conservative base, guess what? People are rejecting Donald Trump. We're hearing more and more stories about smaller crowd sizes. That's why Donald Trump wants this over, because every time he goes to and he loses, some delegates, he loses, 35, 40%. That shows vulnerability. And I think it's going to really reflect in those swing states.
Heidi, thank you. Let's go to Ramesh Ponnuru. So your perspective from the Republican side, the Democrats, if they're saying vulnerability for Donald Trump, how do you see it?
I think it is a vulnerability. I think that Trump has done really well if you think about this as an open seat, but he's done pretty poorly if you think of him as a kind of quasi-incumbent. Ultimately, it is the nominee's job to unify the party. Congresswoman Mace was talking about how Haley needs to quit her campaign to unify the party. Look, fundamentally, he's going to be the winner. He's the one who has to find those disaffected Republicans and moderates and independents and get them to give him another chance.
Ramesh, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Let's go back to Rachel Scott at Donald Trump headquarters. We know that Trump has enjoyed taking shots at Nikki Haley so far along this campaign. Now there's still a few more stops as we head towards Super Tuesday. But notably, as you pointed out tonight, he didn't mention her.
Didn't mention her once during this victory lap, this victory speech that he was taking here in South Carolina, even as he had the South Carolina senators lined up behind him, the party coalescing behind the former president. And look, he's all but laughed off her chances at this point, and he is focused now squarely on this general election and trying to defeat President Joe Biden. One thing that Trump has to be concerned about is, personally, I can't get out of my mind some of these voters that I've talked to who say that they do not like former President Donald Trump. They believe that he brings a lot of chaos and drama. They voted for him twice. They don't want to vote for him again necessarily, and they don't necessarily like President Biden either. That is a major warning sign to both of these candidates now heading into this general election where they are going to have to work overtime to win over a lot of these moderate, independent voters that ultimately swing the general election in November.
Rachel, thank you. Let's go back to Alex Brachet at Nikki Haley headquarters. Alex, no doubt as these numbers are starting to come in, the disappointment level is rising there at Nikki Haley's camp. But what are voters there telling you and the campaign about their hopes in the days to come?
Well, what I can tell you is, we've done this for a while, and behind me, it doesn't look like a campaign headquarter party of a candidate that just got blown out in their own home state. In fact, they're just playing "Don't Stop Me Now" by Queen, and that's really been the messaging. They're looking forward to continuing on, and I will say that as these results have been kind of trickling in, instead of, there have been cheers at the TV as they've seen some of the numbers kind of close the margins between Haley and former President Trump. There's a levity here, and I think part of that is because coming into this, there was an understanding that this was going to be an uphill battle. But as Rachel had mentioned, this framing of the campaign saying that, former Trump has a lot of chaos that comes with him, but also understanding that there are Republicans here that aren't on board with another 4 years of Biden. That is what they're trying to get at. And while this path forward going to Super Tuesday is increasingly narrow, any ground that's gained between now and then is seen as a win for them.
Alex, thank you. Let's come back to Avery Harper and Mary Alice Parks here at the desk. Avery, back to some of the exit polls, because it is really telling, this idea that Haley's been out there talking about how she is the better candidate to go up against Joe Biden. The head-to-head matchup is in her favor, not in Trump's favor. But clearly among at least these voters who turned out the Republicans in this primary in South Carolina, they believe Trump is the one who is able to win.
Right. I definitely think when you look at what happened tonight in South Carolina, what we find is that this Republican Party belongs to former President Donald Trump. And the thing is that there are folks who are voting for Nikki Haley who are going to be looking for a home. So if you look at some of this preliminary exit poll data, we asked Haley voters, is Trump fit to be president if convicted? Nikki Haley's voters, only 15% said yes. 82% said no. Those are voters I think, that are indicating that they would be looking for a home if former President Donald Trump becomes the nominee. That means that they could vote for Donald Trump at the end of the day. They could hold their nose and vote for him. They could be looking to a third party. They could even vote for Joe Biden, but we'll see what happens there. In terms of if Trump is physically and mentally fit to be president, Nikki Haley voters said 22% of them said yes, 77% of them said no. I think, again, that is an indication that some of those voters might be looking for a home in November. According to our latest ABC News Ipsos poll, which was a national poll, and it took place before the South Carolina voters headed out to vote today, we find that age is a vulnerability for both Trump and for Biden. We see that 86% of Americans believe that Biden is too old to serve another term, whereas 62% say Trump is too old to serve another term. That is the argument that Nikki Haley has been trying to make this entire time, that the country needs a new generational leader. Unfortunately, for her to get to a general election to even make that argument, she has to get through a primary, and she just hasn't been able to do that just yet.
Mary Alice, as we've been looking at those numbers, I mean, it may be a small percentage overall across the country, but when we're looking at a race in November, 1-2% changes everything, especially when it's going to come down to a handful of battleground states.
Yeah, it decides it all. I'm thinking about a conversation I had with the chair of the Republican Party in South Carolina yesterday, and he said his state is often the graveyard of presidential campaigns. And we might look back and think that's exactly what happened tonight, that this was the end of Nikki Haley's campaign if she gets blown out like this. But I also pressed him, I pressed the former chair of the Republican Party there about the fact that Donald Trump is polarizing, that he energizes Democrats. Would they acknowledge that? And they both acknowledged that. They know that he is, in that way, riskier. He brings people out who maybe weren't excited to vote for President Biden again, but who tell us they will come out to vote against Donald Trump. And they know that, but they're sticking with him anyway. It is so interesting to me. I get asked all the time, why wouldn't they just pick the one who is more likely to beat President Biden? And I'm not sure I have a good answer for that. It is fascinating to me. But one other thing I just wanted to come back to that we started the night with that I just think is so interesting to end on, the issues that mattered most to the Republican voters that showed up tonight: immigration, abortion near the end. We talk about general election, a general electorate. I'm not sure if that's the same for a general election, but man, the Biden campaign has to be looking at that. They know immigration is a major vulnerability for them, and the former president is making sure that that is the issue he is running on.
And we just saw the number right there, 39% immigration, their top issue in a state that is not a border state. So in some ways reflecting some of the sentiment across the country. Thanks to you both. Let's go back to Rick Klein one more time. Rick, your final thoughts and what you're tracking here as the numbers trickle in.
Yeah, when you're running in a primary, you're running for a couple of different things. One is for votes, for delegates, and we know Donald Trump is in a position right now to really clean up, winning statewide. Right now, he's leading in all 7 congressional districts. He's on track, if these numbers hold, with about a quarter of the expected vote in, to win all 50 delegates out of South Carolina. So whatever you make of the margin, that is a statement. But the margins will matter as well. And what I'm struck by now, watching this map develop, is that there are exactly 2 counties where Nikki Haley is leading: Columbia County, the state capital, also, of course, a college town, and Charleston County, down on in the Low Country. That is where Nikki Haley currently has her home. By the way, she's from the little county of Bamberg, where she's losing pretty badly to Trump. But focusing on those 2, those are the exact same 2 counties that Marco Rubio actually won in 2016 against Donald Trump. Trump won the rest of the state. Very possible that it's that exact same map, but the margins are going to look a lot different with this one-on-one race than in that very scattered race that we saw in South Carolina last time. And looking at what we know about the vote that's in so far, I'll tell you, Whit, there's a lot of opportunity for Trump's number to get bigger than 58%. Right now, about a 16, 17-point lead. I think we're more likely somewhere in the mid-20s by the end of the night, because a lot of the vote that we've gotten in so far is early vote. We know what Donald Trump has said about early vote. He doesn't like it. He doesn't trust it. A lot more attention from the Haley campaign to try to get that vote in early. I think that the margins could grow, and I think the key question is going to be, does Haley get absolutely wiped out of the delegate race? Does she keep it within 20 points? Right now, it doesn't look likely that she's going to get closer, that she's going to close the gap from where she was in New Hampshire about a month ago. So that is going to be a bitter disappointment, however it is spun by the Haley campaign.
Have something to watch. watch as those numbers keep coming in tonight. Rick Klein, Avery, Mary Alice, Rachel, Alex, Heidi, and Ramesh, thanks to our entire team tonight for joining us. That concludes our coverage of the South Carolina primary on this Saturday night. Thank you so much for streaming with us. I'm Whit Johnson at ABC News Election Headquarters in New York. Come back for Good Morning America on ABC in the morning. Have a good night.
Whenever news breaks, we are here in Israel.